Um,
Oh, okay.
Now we're good.
All right, got it. Yeah, so I'm very happy to speak with you. But I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that partially because of my own scheduling conflicts, we're talking about the Bragg memo a month in, and so much has happened since then regarding Bragg and the memo that I'm not really sure what we're debating. It's like he's walked back a lot of it. Governor Katie Hochul recently threatened to unseat him, which is frankly, I think, a huge overreach of executive power, but that's a different issue. He's met with business leaders who have said that he plans to seriously reconsider. So I guess I would start by asking if you think Bragg is still on a dangerous course in terms of like not solving serious crimes.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting situation because he gets painted as having walked it back in the media, including in media that was very critical of him. The Post has talked about him walking it back. Fox News, New York Daily News, they've all sort of said Bragg has retreated. And then when you listen to the words that he says, most of what he's doing is reiterating stuff that is in the memo that he supports and sort of batting away things that were never in the memo in the first place, which, is to his credit. He's identifying things that his critics are saying that weren't in the memo and saying these aren't in the memo. That's accurate. But I do think, the only two, I think, substantive walkbacks I've seen is one that he's said he's willing to prosecute gun possession more aggressively than the memo seemed to indicate that he would be. And two is that he claims to sort of have clarified with his line DAs that he values their discretion. And it's really not clear. The memo places a fairly high burden on line DA's discretion, and it seems like that prompted some concern in the office. It's really hard to tell because it's his account of what happened in his own office, how much discretion they now feel that they have. But he has certainly said he acknowledged that there was an issue there, and he sort of tried to say, yes, you should exercise discretion. Whether or not that plays out, given again how sort of heavy-handed the memo is unclear. A lot turns on that. We know that line DAs have reduced charges in line with the memo a couple of times already, at least. So clearly some of it is still in effect, but it's not totally clear. But again, I think my sort of synthetic point would be, often when he is depicted as walking stuff back, really what he's saying is, I will do the things that I said I was going to do, and I won't do the things that I didn't say I was going to do, which are often people missing what is in the text of the memo itself.
I know that he's definitely stuck to his guns in terms of the overall theme, meaning that he continues to, frankly, vaguely reference the need to balance fairness with safety, which is like, the progressives are balancing fairness with safety. The Eric Adamses are balancing safety with fairness. It's a lot of rhetoric that overlaps. But to get to like more concrete things, and there's a couple of things that you said that I think are really interesting. First of all, I'm not familiar with the cases you're referring to of line DAs going after lower charges, but a really important point to consider is that all line DAs tend to end up with lower charges than they could, because even the most conservative DAs, unless it's a high profile case, will opt for a plea that's a lower charge because they want to rack up guilty pleas, not long sentences in every case. So that's point number one. I don't think that based on examples of DAs during Bragg's tenure, lowering charges necessarily stems from his memo. That's point number one. Point number two, a lot of the discretion that is cited in the original memo sort of weighs the scales on like getting tougher sentences and pretrial detention, right? He says, well, let's avoid incarceration, both pretrial and post-trial, or more realistically post-plea deal, unless like the victim contests this, unless there's like a very obvious threat to public safety. So the discretion's not like, well, you have discretion to like be even more lenient than I want, which I know it's not what you're saying, but it's be like less lenient than you want. And lastly, something I want to bring up is, as far as actions go, there was a case, I think, that was the arraignment was over the weekend, and it was a 16-year-old that was caught with a loaded weapon on the train. And the Manhattan line DA, I don't know their name, but obviously somebody under Bragg's office asked for $10,000 bail, which this kid's family could not pay under any circumstance. You know, the judge said, I hate to do this, but I'm going to put you in jail pre-trial. So it's like, even like the one of the prominent cases that did get some attention, it's like pretty much as conservative of an outcome as you can get, which is like the bail is set in a way that guarantees this kid is going to be going to likely Rikers pre-trial. So I guess like both in what he's saying and already in practice, you don't really see much deviation from like business as usual. Sorry for that was a long rant. I should let you address the different points.
So to talk about the specific cases, what I'm thinking of, there have been a couple of cases where specifically line DAs have downcharged armed robbery to petite larceny.
Sure.
Under the stipulation where it's not armed robbery unless the weapon creates a genuine risk of physical harm. And this is one of the things that's been confusing. Bragg has said, well, you know, the goal there is not if you threaten somebody with an armed weapon, you get downcharged petite larceny. It's like petty larceny, excuse me. And it's like, if that's the case, then you shouldn't say that the behavior does not create a genuine risk of physical harm, because threatening someone with an unloaded weapon does not create a genuine risk of physical harm. That person would be charged with petty larceny under Bragg's memo.
But it's different. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so to talk more generally, sorry, remind me briefly of your second question. I'm just keeping it in order in my head.
Well, the first thing I mentioned is that it's actually like completely regular practice for all DAs of any political persuasion to pursue the less serious charge because they're more likely to get a guilty plea.
Oh. The point is at discretion. Yeah. So my point in those with those specific cases is that it's evidence that the Bragg memo is being implemented as written. Right. It is the case that DAs will downcharge in order to facilitate processing the system. My concern about discretion is that every case is different fundamentally, right? Yeah. It is the case that you want to right. Many cases are going to end where it makes sense to divert people, or it makes sense to become cognizance. That everyone agreed with that status quo ante. The problem in my mind, essentially with the Bragg memo, one of the sort of key problems is that for broad classes of cases, he says incarceration is never the right call. Pretrial incarceration is never the call, and post-conviction or post-plea deal incarceration is never the right call. So like my favorite example is there's been this sort of back and forth about mandatory minima, where the argument is that the Bragg memo, if he charges a crime with any Class D felony or above, if he charges that crime, he's going to have to send the person to prison because there's mandatory minimum in New York State. My response is the whole set, among other responses, the whole set of Class E felonies that many people in New York City would agree should involve jail time. Child endangerment is a great example of Class E felony that many people would intuitively say should involve prison time. But under Bragg's memo as written, there would be a strong presumption against sending somebody who commits child endangerment to prison. I would
contest that. It wouldn't. I mean, both before and after Bragg, it wouldn't automatically trigger a mandatory minimum.
Yes,
but it wouldn't necessarily mean that, like, you know, if somebody, I don't know, like almost flung their kid off a balcony, Michael Jackson style, that they necessarily would get whatever. That like a serious case of child endangerment would automatically not lead to a prison sentence.
What I can say is that the policy of the office is to, quote, not seek a carceral sentence unless it is in any of these specific categories. And child endangerment, felony E, child endangerment is not in those categories. So it could be the case that Bragg's office will say we're going to override it, but that is again, by his own words, an extraordinary expectation. It is either the case that like he is making some dramatic changes to the criminal justice system, or he's making some very small changes. If you want to look at he's making very small changes, then like, why did he issue the memo in the first place? And why did he say this dramatic policy is my goal? He didn't believe it would have a major impact.
Well, I actually have a question for you, generally, because I'm not sure, was the memo supposed to be internal and it was leaked sort of against his will or not? Because it reads to me like a political document. You have that like long intro where he's like, as a child in Harlem, you know? What do you know? Because I
don't know. I mean, there's a memo. Often these day one memos are released as a matter of policy. It's now been published by, if you go to manhattanda.org, you can go read it.
Right.
was not initially published by them. I think I don't know where it came from
Yeah.
initially. But and this is true of many progressive prosecutors. Chesed Boudin, Larry Krasner put out day one memos saying this is going to be the policy of our office. So it would not surprise me. Let me put it this way: it would not surprise me if it was leaked, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was leaked either by Bragg or by line DAs. It's hard to say which.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have literally zero information, and this is pure speculation, but I would think Bragg probably like meant for it to be leaked, sort of miscalculating the political moment, which I think is one of major backlash, right? Like when Chesed Boudin did this, when Larry Krasner did this, like the momentum was very much towards change. And I think given that like Bragg like instantly sought out the help of PR professionals, I think maybe he realized that he kind of like miscalculated the message. He was elected on these policies. Like it's not like he campaigned as a tough on crime DA, then suddenly became a raging hippie on day
Absolutely.
one. So I would imagine that he just sort of like misplayed his hand in terms of PR. I guess
But I
like,
think,
which I'm like, why? Like, you're in the city with the New York Post. Like, what do you think that, who knows?
yeah, I mean, I think I think partially he probably didn't. As you said, I don't think he had a great read on the politics. That it was going to put him at odds with Mayor Adams, or certainly was going to position him weirdly vis-a-vis Mayor Adams. They haven't said anything publicly, although there's clearly been sort of some internal behind the scenes. As you referred to Kathy Hochul's sort of weird situation where she's being pushed to the red on crime by Tom Suozzi. So he's saying we have to get rid of. I will remove Bragg, and that pushes Hochul to the right. I think he didn't expect that, but I think that backlash is it puts Bragg in this sort of weird position of either saying that he's not really going to sort of implement the version of the memo as it reads, that we are going to use incarceration only as a last resort for this narrow set of crimes, is not actually going to be the policy, or he says it's not going to be the policy, but it is going to be the policy. And it's sort of hard to tell what's actually happening.
Right, but when you say a narrow category of crimes, I mean, by narrow category of crimes, that's like pretty much a huge majority of crimes that most people would consider violent and that might presage more violent behavior, right? I mean, and I think like a more general issue when you talk about reform and backlash and blah, 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 is like, if you arrest and hold pretrial men ages like 16 to 25, like you're automatically going to see some sort of immediate decrease in crime, because that's who commits the fucking crime. Because the crimes, right? Like, right. So if you bust more teenagers for like pot, which they're not doing anymore, but let's say potentially carrying weapons or whatever, like there's going to be an immediate decrease, because again, that's who commits the crimes. Like 70-year-old women don't commit that much violent crime. But the problem is that if you are truly seeking to balance fairness with safety, which both conservative or moderate or liberal lawmakers like Eric Adams, however you would categorize him, say is the current priority, and not just tough on crime, like you kind of have to say, like, even if you see an immediate drop in some crimes, if you arrest more people and hold them pre-trial, I mean, A, is that fair? And B, I mean, my major problem with the way that crime statistics are measured is that they're very immediate. So like, there's no real way to gauge whether keeping more people in jail pre-trial is going to have a negative impact on crime rates like 5 years from now, when those people are like traumatized to hell by being in Rikers as teenagers, blah, 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 like a bunch of sort of intangibles that aren't reflected in like immediate crime statistics, especially immediate anecdotes that don't even reflect crime statistics.
And if you'll indulge me to talk just a little bit about sort of the research that Bragg references that I think he draws too firmly on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the sort of synthesis in the literature is that pretrial detention it has negative specific deterrence, which is to say, after you get out of jail, at the margins, you are more likely to offend in the future. But that's actually very different from saying that everybody who goes to Rikers is more likely to offend, right? Because the way that you estimate that is that you look at you look at variation of propensity to incarcerate among judges, and then you look at people whose propensity to be incarcerated varies between judges. So it's like these guys who are on the margins of being incarcerated versus not incarcerated. So there's a whole class of people who are definitely would be incarcerated, who everyone agrees should be incarcerated, who, if you put them in Rikers, would not have negative specific deterrence. There's a whole class of people who, like, a whole set of people who, like, if you put them in Rikers, they definitely have negative specific deterrence. They definitely more likely to offend. So you know, I think when we talk about, and this has to do with Alvin Bragg, this also has to do with bail reform, like, you know, you don't want to say categorically we should always put people in jail, we should never put people in jail. The question is, like, how do you optimize the system so that the people who will be are actual risks of public safety are kept off the streets, B, who will be positively specifically deterred by going to jail are in theory sent to jail, while keeping the people who will be harmed by jail out of jail. I think there are lots of ways to do that, but like blanket policies are a really bad way to do. This is the problem with New York State's bail reform law, is that, like, you know, I'm pretty sympathetic to the argument that money bail is not a good way to measure dangerousness. I think that's logical. But also, judges in New York State aren't allowed to detain people based upon risk while they're out. They're only allowed to detain people based on risk of flight. That's a major issue. If you empower judges to detain people based on risk of future offending, then you change the calculus. If you empower judges to detain people based on what the specific deterrent effect will be, that's a very different calculus. So my point is, like, I think that when you talk about the long run adverse effects of something like sending somebody to Rikers, it depends a lot on the person and who they are, and you can isolate that a little bit. And an optimal system is absolutely one in which we don't, you know, an optimal system is one in which you divert the first time misdemeanor offender. That's like not a good use of public funds, especially if you can do something efficient like a desk clearance ticket. But it's also not a system in which you have blanket policies that say we will presumptively release most people except for these particular instances. What I would say, and this is my very last thought, is important to keep in mind within New York City specifically, the population of Rikers has fallen in front of me 61% over the past 10 years. There were 5,000 people on Rikers Island. It's down from like 11,000 10 years ago. 70 to 75% of those on any given day are violent felony offenders. If the goal is to like further decarcerate and specifically further reduce the pretrial incarceration population, like, you do have to start releasing dudes onto the street who are likely to be involved in gun violence, who are likely to serially victimize, who are likely to be serial offenders. Like, you know, the city of New York has done a lot of work to pick, as it were, the low-hanging fruit of like first-time misdemeanors over the past 10 years. That's like plausibly good, but it means it gets harder and harder to keep adding, you know, keep picking out the marginal guy who you can free without creating more risk in the community.
No, I mean, that's absolutely true. And something that, like, serious criminal justice reformers acknowledge is that if you're going to have any like substantive drop in mass incarceration, whether that's prison, jail, anywhere in the country, like, you are going to have to expand the category of potential, like, people potentially released in community supervision, on probation, and have that include people with a history of violent offenses. But like, let me just back up really, really quickly. When you, very early in this, when you said something like, well, if you think nobody should be in pretrial detention, I think that Alvin Bragg does not think that, right? So the guy, I'm a blogger, not a DA. Sure. So the guy, like, promoting the policies that will have an actual impact, and like not what I write on my Substack, has not said no one should be in jail pre-trial. He has said we want to focus on the people who we think pose a serious danger because they've already committed a violent crime. We don't want to clog up the system with these lesser charges, in large part because, you know, you have to admit that part of the increase in crime in 2020 was because, due to the pandemic, the courts were moving slower. Well, the courts also move slower if they have to process more cases, including more cases that involve less serious offenses.
So I mean,
yeah, but I mean, as far as, you know, you moved on to bail reform, which I think is like a very different issue, right? We're talking about, am I incorrect when I think that judges in New York State still have the power to remand someone if they gauge that they truly are a threat to the community? Or am I wrong about that?
You can only remand on the basis of flight risk.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Right. If they think they'll fail to appear, they can impose, right. So the goal is they can impose requirements, they can substitute monitoring, and if they've evidenced your risk for failure to appear, or if you've committed a Class D violent felony or above, you're excluded from a lot of the restrictions. But they are not allowed, and prior to bail reform, they were also not allowed to make judgments based upon risk of dangerousness. Yeah, I mean, I think
so. It's not an issue of bail reform then.
No,
or it's not a problem that has been introduced because
I think
bail reform.
Yes. I think bail reform compounds the problem. The point that I was trying to make there is that a way to optimize the system in general would be to make considerations not on the basis of the competency, the ability to pay, which I think we agree is a silly way to do it.
Yes, it's horrible.
But on risk to the community. The point about Bragg, it's true. I mean, I think if you asked Bragg privately, he would say, I don't want to get rid of. Maybe he would say he wanted to get rid of jail, but I don't think he would. Like I don't. But I do think that there are lots of categories of offenses. There are lots of categories of offenses that are not covered in the memo that probably merit. So like serious robbery.
Serious or what do you mean? Aggravated or armed? Okay, aggravated robbery.
Yeah. Aggravated robbery. Or there's some if you engage in, if you're a serial retail theft offender, not even like light shoplifting, but like ORT, organized retail theft, which is like complicated category, but like let's stick with it. Where if you're engaged in not merely sort of like as Bragg likes to say, if you're engaged in like shoplifting to feed your family, okay, that you want to divert that person. If you were involved in major theft, Bragg has said maybe we'll prosecute that person. Bragg's memo says we will not try to detain that person pre-trial. That is a person who is a major risk to the community, does major harm to the community, and maybe he will in effect actually prosecute that person. That's not what his memo says. So that's like point one, is that the lots of crimes left out, and then point two is that there is a lot of variation, and by doing what Bragg has done by saying there were violent criminals, and then there were like people who are stealing to feed their family, you leave out a lot of those much more nuanced cases where like ultimately what matters is DA discretion, is the ability of DAs to say the public safety interest will be served by incarcerating this person versus not. If you compel all your DAs to say, I'm going to file a pre-incarceration memo, if you say you need to get special approval from your supervisor before going after this obvious case, you're going to bias against detaining those guys who do pose a threat. And that's that's what concerns me. I think you're right that Bragg has said I want to put violent offenders in prison, but there are like serious violent offenders in prison, but then there are other classes of offenders who are worth detaining pre-trial, worth incarcerating, that he has excluded systematically and also excluded his DAs from considering the detention of.
Is there any evidence that somebody who faces prosecution for like serial or large scale retail theft is going to be like, oh, I'm going to use this time before my case is resolved to steal more shit, which can be used to build the case against me further?
Like, are there lots of individual instances? Yeah, absolutely.
And I think cases where there is a danger, and these are very emphatically ruled out by Bragg, is domestic violence cases, right? Because if somebody involved in a serious domestic violence altercation is released pre-trial, that's when the motherfucker like kills his wife, right? Like, so those are, but like other cases where it's not like a crime of passion, that's a horrible term, Jesus, but like a crime or like a lesser crime is much more likely to lead to a greater crime if the person is released pre-trial. That's domestic violence. That's not like something like retail theft where people have a lot more. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I don't. I think that it will vary. Some people will and some people won't. But I have two answers to that. One is that there were lots of instances of offenders who are released on bail who say, in part because there's the lack of the deterrent threat of like going to jail for an extended period of time, they say, okay, I'm going to keep offending. There are cases in New York City and San Francisco both of serial car thieves who get picked up and then released, and they say, I'm not going to go before a judge for 2 years, right? The average wait time in New York City is 2 years. Like, that's not a deterrent, right? It's not swift and certain.
Really, if you had a potential prison term hanging over your head for 2 years, you'd be like, cool, I'm just going to do more crime now.
I mean,
that's gonna like up the prosecutor's leverage to potentially give you more time or
what
make you plead to something more serious than they would if you had stopped committing those crimes.
what we know is that every month on release, and this is the New York Mayor's office data. I don't actually remember the Office of courts data, but that's the cumulative. Every month on release, about 4% of released offenders reoffend. And that adds up, right? It's not just like 4% reoffend while they're out. It's like if you're out over 24 months, your probability of reoffending each month is about 4%. It's like 3% are misdemeanors, about 0.5% are violent felonies, and then 0.5% are non-violent felonies. So there clearly are people. There's a subset of that population who are like, yeah, and there are lots of reasons for it, right? Like if you're involved,
go ahead.
If you're involved in organized retail theft, there are lots of pressures on you. There are economic pressures. There are social pressures. That's your social circle. That's who you hang out with. If you are organized, if your life is organized around a criminal social network, you probably don't have great like ability to judge future costs versus present costs. Like
then why would you make the calculation that because Alvin Bragg has said he's not going to prosecute these cases harshly that you're going to, you know what I mean? That's also doing a long-term cost benefit analysis. So why are they doing that cost benefit analysis, but not this cost benefit analysis?
I mean, I think in that case, jail matters in terms of time discounting. Jail matters more than prison. I think there's sort of thorny issues there with using jail as a punishment, but from a purely factual perspective, I think that I will be out the next day and I won't have to post bail and I don't need to worry about this. That absolutely changes people's perspective. Again, it doesn't change everybody's perspective, but there are lots of people on the margin who are like, again, I don't have to think about what's going to happen to me in 2 years. I'm not used to thinking about what's going to happen. And you can talk about why. I'm not used to thinking about what's going to happen to me in 2 years because I live in poverty. I'm not used to thinking about what's going to happen to me in 2 years because systemic racism has induced me to not struggle with thinking about the possibilities of my future because I'm disadvantaged,
right, of course, yeah.
social connections, whatever. The fact of the matter is, there is clearly a subpopulation for whom that's going to be true, regardless of whether or not there's the possibility of an offense hanging over their head in 2 years. Like I do think that
then that's in cases like this, when somebody is sort of like so low on the social ladder and so battered by like their own poor choices, systemic classism and racism, that they just like don't plan for the future in this way. So you're saying, then isn't that an argument for essentially like for a cash bail, where you're saying like, well, people who have nothing to live for, we better jail them because they're, I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What I would say is
saying that like poorer people are more likely to reoffend if they're not detained pre-trial and therefore should be targeted for pre-trial detention.
No.
I was in the debate team. I'm kidding.
No, I don't.
Right. Isn't that the sort of automatic like result though? Like, isn't that?
Oh, yeah, totally. Well, okay. So what I would say is the following thing. The goal of the criminal justice system, as we were talking about, is like balancing public safety and fairness. It is the case that for some subset of offenders who are in that category, you want to give them second chances. If you have the guy who's like first, it's probably A, good for public safety, and B, good for fairness for the first time misdemeanor to get off lightly, for the guy to get off on his arrest the first time around. But if you have a situation in which somebody is a frequent or serial offender, in which somebody has a high propensity to offend, the question of why they have a high propensity to offend is like ultimately not the only question the criminal justice system is responsible for asking, right? I would argue it's actually not primarily the criminal justice system's responsibility to ask that question. It's primary responsibility to say, how is this person's behavior going to affect the people around them and the norms of society as a whole? Like, yeah, it may be the case that, one guy decides to offend for a whole host of socioeconomic reasons. And then this other guy who's in the same set of socioeconomic circumstances says, I'm not going to offend. At the end of the day, the functional criminal justice system is to say, like, these behaviors we have decided democratically are not tolerated. These are bad for our society and we want to punish them. We want there to be consequences for them. We're going to enforce that. And what determines it sort of at the root is less relevant than that mandate.
Okay, well, do we want to punish these crimes, or do we want to apply approaches to them that are less likely to lead to future serious offenses, right? You don't have to be, you can argue that a diversionary program could lead to less chances that the person is going to hurt the society in the future than jail time. And there's really like not really any metrics or statistics, as far as I know, that say either one or the other is better. In fact, a lot of evidence says that diversionary programs might be better to quelling future crimes.
So a lot depends on what the diversionary program, right?
Yes,
Right. The essential question is of social science is always compared to what. There's some evidence that diversionary programs work well for certain class of offenders. If you're young,
yes.
women benefit from diversionary programs disproportionately to men, I believe. I'd have to go look that up. Drug offenders sometimes benefit from diversionary programs relative to jail for sort of like obvious reasons, specifically if they get access to treatment. Although the quality of the treatment varies dramatically. And in regards
to worse than jail, actually.
Sorry.
Some of the penalties imposed by drug courts are like worse than jail.
Yeah,
it's not New York specifically, like
there's
overall.
a lot, right? And New York has a variety of diversion. New York is on the front line of a variety of diversionary approaches. All 5 boroughs have drug courts. Manhattan, Brooklyn. I forget if the other boroughs have mental health courts, problem-solving courts in general are sort of like at the front line of diversion. I think the stuff that Bragg wants to do with, gosh, I'm trying to generate the term, restorative justice is interesting. There's some evidence for it. A lot of it's really low quality. But like when I just said diversion works for some classes of offenders, there are also lots of offenders for whom diversion doesn't work. For whom you're just like giving them, a free chance, which they will squander or abuse. The synthesis of the literature, the most recent synthesis of the literature on offending, on the effect of incarceration on a specific deterrence. So not if you put somebody in prison, they're not going to commit crimes in the rest of society. They might commit crimes in prison, they're not going to commit crimes in the rest of society. So there's an incapacitation effect, is what, for the benefit of your readers, what we would call it. But then we can also talk about again that specific deterrence, like what is the when they get out, what will that do to their propensity to offend? And what the evidence says is at the margins of whether or not to offend somebody, if you're the judge in court, at the margins of whether or not you offend somebody, prison has either no specific deterrent effect, or there's one study that says it has a negative specific deterrent effect, which I think has to do with where the data come from. But like we can plausibly say, if you're deciding whether or not to send somebody to jail, specific deterrence doesn't really matter. Once you're in jail, once you're in prison, not jail, once you're in prison, there's good evidence that the longer the sentence, the greater the specific deterrence. Not the greater the incapacitation, the greater the specific deterrence. Part of what
that's in part because people's the chances that someone's going to reoffend, the older they get, drops the most, right?
But even if you control for that, even if you control for age, similar offenders of the same age get the longer that they're in, the less the probability of offending is when they get out.
So there are studies that compare length of sentence cross-referenced with age. Yeah. And it completely gets rid of the age as a factor in there.
Yeah. So what you do is you look at sentencing guidelines and you use discrete jumps in the sentencing guideline to isolate the causal effect of length of sentence. You compare people just below to just above.
Okay.
And that, there are a couple of interesting, and what I take away from that is that like when you're thinking about the population of potential offenders, the specific deterrence offense is like, a potential incarcerees deterrent offense is like effect is like and you should only think you had incapacitation. When you start talking about people who have been sent to prison, there's a large population for whom there are benefits to society, and whether or not they're benefits to them is a matter, you can talk about how to do that better and worse, but there are benefits to society of them being in for longer, which again, to circle way back around, there are people who are benefited by diversion. There are also the social benefit is to put them in prison for a very long time.
Well, can I just say though, if the studies that you're talking about that cross-reference prison sentences in a way that takes out age, like being old versus being young is a factor. Well, if we're going to go back to Bragg, his directive in regards to prison time, nothing to do with jail, but prison sentences, is just to ask for, no life without parole. and to kind of like move away from 20-year sentences, right? 20 years or more. What do we want people, aside from like possibly homicide, to serve more than 20 years in prison for? And do those, just the difference between 1 year in prison versus 4 years in prison, the same as 5 years in prison versus 20 years in prison in terms of balancing safety and fairness?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. One is that the strongest argument for long prison terms and a LWOP in New York State is that New York State has banned the death penalty. There are certain offenses that many people would agree, although I suspect not you or many of your readers, which is fine, merit execution. So like the example that I like to give is, and I won't generate his name, the guy who drove a truck up on the sidewalk in the middle of Manhattan in an attempted terror attack.
Right.
I think ended up getting left without parole. In New York State, and like most people would agree, that guy merits both on retributive grounds, that like in it like I would say in that situation that guy merited execution. Other people will disagree.
Right.
But also on deterrent grounds, the question is like, is there a sentence? Is 20 years an adequate sentence? Many people would intuitively say no. When you talk about like, you know, minimizing public risk when they get out, it is the case that people's propensity to offend declines with age. That's probably true. But like, there are lots of young offenders. People can go in at 18 and come out at 38 and still be prone to offending. B, that implies that you should incarcerate young people for a longer period of time, which is, I think, a separate sort of justice question that most people would not intuitively say there should be a sentence penalty for being too young.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I would just say the guy that like very horribly and tragically killed those people using his vehicle. So you think that if his sentence were life instead of life without parole, meaning that like when he's 80, he has a chance to go before a parole board where the parole board can tell him to go fuck himself, like the way that, you know, liberal Gavin Newsom has that to Sharon. You think that that is not enough of a deterrent for like future offenders that want to kill a bunch of people with their car, which is an extremely rare crime, you know? Like I don't really understand that.
I mean, I think
I actually do think that, I mean, maybe you're more of a badass than I am. If I have to spend a year in prison, I would die. So 20 years, I mean, that's a lot of prison time. You know what I mean? That's your kids grow up without you. You know, you get out when God knows what's replaced the internet. I don't know, the metaverse. It's 20 years is not a lenient prison sentence. And like two things, like, first of all, actually the data that shows that older people are almost like, are extremely unlikely to reoffend is like pretty solid across the board. And two, it's also been like widely recognized that when most people do whatever like shoddy cost benefit analysis they do in committing a crime, almost everyone thinks in terms of whether or not they're going to get caught versus the length of the sentence, probably in part because even short sentences are long as hell in America compared to most of the rest of the world.
So what I would say is that, notwithstanding, you talk about like international comparisons, but the median, I'm going to forget the statistic, but the median length is for felony offending is, I want to say 1.4 years, but I'd have to go look that up. It is shorter than many people intuit. Although I agree, I don't want to go to jail for 16 months either. I'm not excited about that. I don't want to get prison for 16 months either.
It's actually, I'm sorry, the average, nationally, the average prison sentence is 5 years.
Okay, I have to go find the statistic. So what I would say is, in general, most offending does cluster, like offenses that would merit 20 years are relatively rare. 20-year sentences are relatively rare. And my view is that in those circumstances, often our moral intuitions, not even necessarily like what will be deterrent, but what we think is appropriate by virtue of the justice, says that they should get longer. Right. I've written about Sirhan, that case. And my view is that, my view is that the entire dispute about Sirhan's parole is only a byproduct of the fact that he shot Bobby Kennedy in the middle of the death penalty moratorium in the 70s.
Right.
Or sorry, he shot Bobby Kennedy before the death penalty moratorium. His death sentence was invalidated by the
Yeah.
moratorium. Throughout human history, the sentence for assassinating a major political figure has been death. I think that's appropriate. Again, people will disagree, but I think I think that it is perfectly that once you take that sort of like retributive penalty off the table for such specific and heinous crimes, really like rare but serious offenses in which we think first the Boston bombings, or other terror attacks, the killing of national officials. When we talk about those like most serious offenses, actively handicapping ourselves ends up running up against like our moral intuitions for what's fair. It's crazy to me that Anders Breivik is going to get out of Swedish prison in 20 years. That's he'll be up for parole. That's nuts to me.
Right, except that yes, that is nuts, but we're not Sweden, so a
Sure.
high profile case like that would never. I mean, name me one sentence of that for a crime of that magnitude that's led to 20 years, to a 20-year sentence. And again, going back to Bragg, this is where for offenses like that, part of the discretion that he names is victims, right? If the victim says, no, this person deserves more time in prison, that's taken into account. Very few prosecutors are going to opt for the most lenient sentence if a crime is as high profile as somebody mowing down, like how many people did he kill? I forget, the guy in New York.
I'd have to go look it up.
Or the murder of like a beloved figure that like changed the course of history, whatever. Like data shows that, again, both conservative and liberal prosecutors pursue more lenient charges in most cases because they want guilty pleas. In high profile cases, almost everyone pursues the highest sentence possible.
Sure. But so
Bragg doesn't say, I don't want to see any sentence over 20 years. He says, if you're going to seek a sentence over 20 years, there better be a good reason. And that reason could include everything from what the victim wants to like mitigating factors to which possibly might even include what you cite, which is like the moral horror of something.
Yes.
And the potential for like further risks to public safety, which you could consider that the lack of deterrent for future crimes committed by other people fall under the rubric of a threat to public safety, even if that particular person is incarcerated for 20 years.
So the language of Bragg's memo is when seeking carceral sentence, following rules apply, absent exceptional circumstances. You are right that he will say it is plausible that he says the office shall not seek a sentence life without parole. The office requests no more than 20 years unless required by law, absent exceptional circumstances. Plausible
by law, right?
Yeah. It is plausible that people say in these exceptional circumstances we will do that. But if that is the case, I think that the reason you have those, you have cases like LWOP. You've charges like LWOP is for those exceptional circumstances. Is for those cases where like everybody kind of agrees this is a moral travesty. And so it is weird in my mind for him to rule that out as a possible tool. It is weird.
But there's not a single case where you have a super like that kind of crime where even if they were eligible for parole, A, the parole board agrees, and B, an executive doesn't overturn it, like Gavin Newsom did in the Saran case. Can you think of a single example where somebody convicted of a crime of that degree of like her horror and heinousness got parole and like went free?
John Hinckley Jr. is walking around and he's kind of weird. The guy who shot Reagan.
Oh, okay.
And he's kind of weird because like, I mean, he is certainly mentally ill, and it's not clear the extent to which the mental illness incapacitated him from making moral judgments. There's some dispute about that. He was in prison. I believe Hinckley was in prison. I'd have to go look that up. But like, Hinckley is now recording music that you can listen to on Twitter. So it happens.
Wait, I'm sorry, he got paroled at what, like when?
I'd have to go look it up.
Okay.
Yeah, attempted assassination. In 2016, a federal judge that ruled that Hinckley. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity.
That's not a parole issue.
Remained in institutional psychiatric care for over 3 decades. public outcry of the verdict led to the Insanity Defense Reform Act. In 2016, a federal judge ruled that Hinckley could be released from psychiatric care as he is no longer considered a threat to himself or others, albeit with many conditions. After 2020, a ruling was issued that Hinckley may showcase his artwork, writings, and music publicly under his own name. He's a weird case, and I will admit that's just like the first one that came to mind.
Sure.
It is right. The Department of Justice is currently waffling over whether or not it's going to go after the living Tsarnaev brother. They like dodge the question when asked about it. Whether they're going to actually seek the death penalty.
Of course they are. You know, that's the reason Biden hasn't like performed on his promise to get rid of the federal death penalties, because it's Tsarnaev brother. I bet you. How much do you want to bet? How much do they pay a conservative think tank? $100 that the Justice Department is not going to vacate the death penalty.
How much are you betting?
$100.
I will take that bet.
Okay.
Sorry. No. I will bet $100 that the Biden Department of Justice does not. Wait, no, they vacated the death penalty against Tsarnaev. I would bet $100 that the Biden Department of Justice does not does not try to reinstate the death penalty against him.
What? They haven't vacated it. Why would they have to reinstate something they haven't gotten rid of?
They have.
They have what?
The appellate court an appellate court vacated Tsarnaev's death sentence in July 2020, ruling he didn't get a fair trial due to potential jurist bias over exposure to news coverage of there was no fair jury in Boston, which duh.
That's fair, but that's an appellate court, not the Biden Justice Department. They don't want to pursue the death penalty.
Yeah, but Biden Justice Department can seek to have the death penalty reinstated.
Okay, hold on a second. You're changing the goalpost a little bit, right?
No, this is what I'm going to get on.
If Biden does not prioritize like the speedy execution of Tsarnaev, I don't think so.
If Donald Trump was still president right now, the DOJ would have filed to reinstate the death sentence, I think, and Biden has not.
I mean,
I think that will move through. What?
If the election had been fair and Trump were still president, he would fast track the execution of Tsarnaev. That is some history. Some what's it called? Yeah. We'll pinpoint the parameters of the bet.
Okay. I'm happy to make the bet. I think that synthetically, the Biden Department of Justice will not try to execute. It's Joe Tsarnaev is the one who's still alive.
Yeah,
will not try to execute Joe Tsarnaev while he's in office.
I mean, I think that's totally possible, but he's also not going to repeal the federal death penalty, I think in large part because of Tsarnaev.
Of what?
Of Tsarnaev, sorry, I can't
pronounce.
You know, Biden has said, because like, as you know, a very, very, very serious Catholic, that he is absolutely opposed to the death penalty. And I think the reason he is not going to, get rid of the federal death penalty, I suspect, is in large part because of the Boston case, because that's not going to win your ass re-election, right?
And I've written about this. I think more generally, it's a losing issue, and he knows that it's a losing issue. I think that Joe Biden, people in the Justice Department want to get rid of the federal death penalty, absolutely. And I think that they will continue to do what they have in effect. The death penalty is under review and will remain under review, much the same way it was at the end of the Obama administration. They will do de facto abolition without actually moving on it. And the reason is that they know that 60% of the country supports executions, 2/3 oppose abolishing the death penalty, and while they support it, they also there's no benefit to them politically. It's just like a freebie for Republicans.
But, more and more people, like the opposition to the death penalty has been on the steady increase, right? And actually, just this weekend, I saw that 6 Republican governors in states, including Utah, have pushed repealing the state death penalty.
Yeah, so support for the death penalty has declined generally since its peak in the 1990s. That's not a huge surprise given what's happened to violent crime rates, and there's historically a relationship between those two things. There continues to be majority support. It's also the case that the standard question systematically undercounts general support for the death penalty, right? You ask people, do you support the death penalty for murder? I don't support the death penalty for murder, and I'm pretty tough on crime because I don't support the death penalty for every murder. I support it for some
Right, of
murders.
course, yeah.
If you ask people, do you support abolishing the death penalty? 2/3 say no. Majorities across races. I think even majorities across parties. Although I'd have to go back and look at the Quinnipiac poll. There is most people share. Many people share the intuition we should preserve the death penalty. Yeah, I mean, there's always been this sort of like minoritarian Republican thing that's like,
Right, because of the cost and the Christian stuff, and yeah.
Well, but when you sort of go do the math, I think it's conservatives concerned about the death penalty, the sort of like, I think AstroTurf group that does this stuff. They'll say, look,
what's the AstroTurf?
They're part of a larger anti-death penalty consortium that mostly does non-conservative issues. They're sort of like under this umbrella. But CCATCP will put out like, here are the 40 Republican state legislators that voted to overturn the death penalty. And it's like, yeah, out of how many thousands of Republican state legislators?
Oh, CCRAP, right. That's true. Yeah, they are like, they actively lobby against the death penalty under a conservative, umbrella.
Right. I mean, I think and this goes back to the point about Biden. I think you are right that he will not get rid of it for ultimately political reasons, because it's not a popular thing to do, and it's not worth spending capital on when he has other priorities. It's not a top priority. It's a priority for some of his, some people within the Democratic Party, but they ultimately don't have his ear on this particular issue. So we'll keep getting the moratorium that we have. But because we'll keep getting this de facto moratorium, Jefferson is not gonna, they're not gonna pursue his execution in the next 3 years. That's my claim.
Right.
Sorry that we've deviated from the Bragg memo a little bit.
That's fine. I mean, yeah, good talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is like the crime, Brett Stevens, Gail Collins, except not stupid.
I'm happy to. I hope that I provided content. I'm glad that you guys are doing the Substack. I appreciate the distilled.
And I'm trying so hard to not, because I mean, I'm already noticing that I do it a little bit. So I mean, usually like most of the work I do is with like, left-leaning. So I do Reason though. I write for Reason a lot. But yeah, I mean, there's like they all have like very rigorous fact checking and editing, and I'm trying to like maintain that with the Substack and not just like be like rant, like preconceived notions. So hopefully talking to people that I don't agree with on everything already is a useful thing. But yeah, great. Is there anything you wanted to add and talk about more?
I'm totally happy. I will send you the recording if you want me to. I made a variety of factual claims, so if you'd like me to cite stuff, you should hit me up and I will go dig that up, where I'll say, no, I was totally wrong, and cop to that. Other than that, I'll send you the recording. And thank you.
Do you mind if I just like post the video, because I realize that I don't really want to spend 35 hours transcribing?
Sure, I'm fine with that.
Do you mind? Okay, cool.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, I will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Bye.